Hello, today's February 29th, 2024. Set your watches appropriately in case you missed the day somehow. You're already on March 1st without us. So leaping forward into the present, we have Professor Rob Jenkins. Tell us who you are, what you're about, and some of your writings I've found in Brownstone to be fascinating. We'll get to those a little bit, but tell us perhaps the impetus for your writing.
Okay, well, first of all, Randall, thank you so much for having me on your show. I'm very honored to do it and enjoying myself very much. It's a beautiful day here in Georgia where I live, and I opted to sit outside, so I'm just having a grand old time. I am an English professor by trade. I teach at Georgia State University, actually at one of our branch campuses out in the suburb of Alpharetta, if people know anything about the Atlanta area, which is nice. I don't have to go downtown very often except for meetings occasionally, and that's very nice too. I've been teaching college writing now for about 38 years. I've had quite a varied background and career. Just in terms of higher ed, I've been involved with higher ed obviously for well over 40 years if you go back to my own undergraduate years. And I started out at a small, prestigious private liberal arts college, and I transferred from there to a medium-sized regional university, and then I went to a big land-grant university, and I've taught at big universities, and I've taught at community colleges, and I've just had a wealth of experience in higher ed. I've been a professor, obviously. I was an administrator of one sort or another for about 20 years. I was a department chair. I was an academic dean. I was director of a large college-wide program. I was also, and sometimes I hesitate to admit this because people on the academic side will sometimes automatically just, deduct 10 points from my IQ. But I was a college basketball coach and athletic director for about 13 years. But at very small colleges, so I taught. That whole time I was teaching English and coaching the basketball team and driving the bus and washing the uniforms and sweeping the floor. So, and it was a lot of fun until my own kids started getting a little older, and then I got into administration, so I could go home every evening. And then about 10 years ago, I got out of administration so that I could spend more time writing and researching and traveling and speaking, and I've been doing a lot of that for the last 10 years. Always on the conservative side. I guess that makes me sort of a rare animal, an English professor who also happens to be conservative. I'm not the only one. I could name some others. I won't here because I don't necessarily want to out them. But to be an outspoken conservative professor of any sort is kind of rare these days. And I've been very fortunate. I've had good bosses who have, been very tolerant of me and colleagues. And of course I have tenure. That's nice. That makes it a little more difficult. I have had a couple of occasions where people tried to get rid of me for something that I had written, but they were ultimately unsuccessful, for which I'm very grateful. But a lot of this really sort of came to a head for me, as it did for many people, in the spring of 2020. When we shut our campus down and we basically shut our society down over fear of a virus that from the very beginning seemed to me to be overblown. I mean, I'll admit that at first I was like, okay, well, maybe this is bad. Maybe, maybe it's, the return of the bubonic plague or something, and it's going to wipe out half of society, because that's the way they were kind of presenting it. But it became clear to me very early on, by the end of that March or, early April anyway, that wasn't the case. And I began advocating for reopening society, reopening schools, reopening universities. And I'm fortunate to be in Georgia, which is a red state. And our governor I believe he was the very first one in the country to reopen, although we reopened very, very tentatively. But the more I looked at what was going on, the more I delved into the writings of people like Jay Bhattacharya and Robert Malone and Elgato Malo. I don't even know who he is, but I really appreciate his writing. Eugippius over in Europe. The other people that were involved in the Great Barrington Declaration. I became aware of Jeffrey Tucker pretty early on in the lockdowns, maybe by April or so, because I was looking for information, for somebody to tell me the truth about what was going on, and I didn't trust the government at all. And I came across the American Economics Research Institute, or AIER, something about economics and research in there. I'm not entirely sure what the acronym stands for, but Jeffrey was writing for them at the time, and I began following him. And when he left there and started Brownstone, I sort of followed him over there. And pretty quickly, one of my ambitions became to write for Brownstone, because I liked what they were doing. I admired the people who were writing for them. I thought they were very smart people, and I wanted to be counted among their number. And I had been writing at that point for townhall.com, for American Thinker. I write quite a bit for the James G. Martin Center for Academic Renewal, which is a libertarian think tank out of North Carolina. But I really wanted to write for Brownstone. So I sent Jeffrey a couple of things, and he was kind of lukewarm about them. The first couple of things I sent him. I'll tell you a funny story. I don't mean to embarrass Jeffrey here, but he's told the story himself, so I think I'm on firm ground. I sent him a piece, and in that piece, one of the things I said was that the death totals we were hearing from the CDC, the COVID death totals we were getting from the CDC, were fraudulent. I use that word, fraudulent. And Jeffrey wrote me back and said, I like this piece, but gee, I just think I think fraudulent is maybe a step too far. And I said, okay. And I sent it to Town Hall, and they published it. Well, about a year later, which was about a year ago, I wrote back to him and said, remember that piece I sent you? And you said that you thought it might be an exaggeration to say the death counts were fraudulent. Do you still think that? And he wrote back and said, no, you were right at the time. So, but anyway, I finally succeeded in sending him something that he liked and published. I believe the first piece I published for them was called Once More to the Lectern, about my journey sort of coming out of COVID lockdowns and semi-lockdowns. Because even in Georgia, yes, we reopened, but we reopened very, very gingerly. I was only allowed to meet with 6 students at a time, and it was very difficult to navigate that. And yet I did, and I sort of got used to it. Even when circumstances are negative, you become acclimated to them, right? And so when we came out of that, it was surprising to me a little bit that it actually required some effort on my part to go back to the way I had been doing things before. But I thought it was necessary. Not that I haven't changed anything. And some of what I do now has been informed by things that I learned during the lockdowns. For example, I learned to use technology a lot more efficiently and to greater effect than I ever had before, because I wasn't super interested in it. But during the lockdowns, I had to become interested in it, and I learned that there are some advantages to it. But for the most part, I've gone back to doing things the way I did before, and I wrote about that journey. I actually wrote that piece for the Chronicle of Higher Education. Now, a little bit of background here. Another thing that some of your listeners might recognize about me is that for 18 years, I was a columnist for the Chronicle of Higher Education. Writing not quite monthly, but maybe 8 or 10 times a year, like I said, for 18 years. But I kind of got canceled there, sort of low-key canceled. They never came out and said, okay, you're persona non grata, we're not going to publish any more of your work. But they just stopped publishing it and basically stopped communicating with me. So I wrote that piece Once More to the Lectern, which is very much in keeping with other things that I've written for them over the years. And I sent it to them, and I didn't hear back, and I didn't hear back, and I didn't hear back. And I finally emailed my editor, who I've been working with for 18 years now. We've had a great relationship for 18 years. And I said, what's going on here? She said, oh, I've just been busy. I'll get to it. And then another 3 or 4 months went by and nothing. And I finally wrote her back and said, okay, I'm just, it's obvious you're not going to run it. I don't know what's going on above your pay grade. If you're being told not to publish my work anymore because of other things that I've written, I don't know what's going on, but I'm withdrawing it. And so I sent it to Jeffrey, and he liked it, and he published it. And I published 10 or 11 other things since then. So that's kind of the story of how I came to write for Brownstone.
Well, thank you so much for that. Once more to the lectern, that's redolent of E.B. White?
Yes, that is, yes. An essay by E.B. White that I teach in my freshman writing classes, or used to anyway, Once More to the Lake. And I open up that piece by saying, it turns out you can go home again, which of course is a nod to Thomas Wolfe, right?
The other Tom Wolfe.
The other Tom Wolfe.
Thomas Wolfe was my second favorite Tom Wolfe.
Okay, he's your second favorite Tom Wolfe. Well, he's my favorite Tom Wolfe, I have to say. But both of those stories are about losing something and trying to find it again. And that was my story too, because I love to teach. I love being in a classroom with students, and that was ripped away from me. Now, the losses that I suffered are minuscule compared with the losses that many other people suffered. So I'm not trying to make anybody feel sorry for me, but nevertheless, it was a real loss, and I mourned it. So when I had the opportunity to try to go back and recapture some of that, I did. As I said, informed by some things that I had learned in the meantime.
Well, I'm glad you did go back, and I'm glad you've had the perspective to enlighten us with it, because I read that piece. I enjoyed it, and I've read some of your other pieces as well. We'll try to get to some of those as we go. My wife is a professor locally, and so I've heard some of her stories. Even as recently as a few weeks ago, there were masks on again. I don't know. My own piece that the illustrious and beloved Jeffrey Tucker refused wound up getting published in the Daily Skeptic. And Jeffrey was polite enough to say he had erred in that regard. So I'm in his debt for that admission. But it pointed out that Omicron is, not really necessarily even a genomic descendant from SARS-CoV-2 and that cluster of the other Greek letter congeners, alpha, beta, gamma, delta. I think they moved to kappa, whatever. And then there was even a lambda. Anyway, mind you, I don't know if you know. I assume you know your Greek alphabet. They did skip over xi, chi, because so as not to offend the governor of Wuhan, the super, right. PRC's Xi. So they moved to Omicron. Anyway, that's side note. But the things that are going on campus now, I mean, you point out a couple different things that happened, as it were, and I'm just going to give one tiny anecdote here. I'm in a civic group in Newton, Massachusetts, and we were in the news nationally because there was an illegal teachers strike here, and it made, again, national news, whatever. And leaving that all aside, I have a Newton TV show monthly, and this has been a topic of interest. And the enrollment at Newton schools has gone down 14%. And I'm wondering whether part of it is the illumination, the enlightenment, as it were, to see what in fact kids were being fed and taught, during the remote learning part. And part of it was, the fact that schools just were not there; they were not present. I think the root word of college is collegium, is to read together. And I'm not sure how much reading gets done. It certainly wasn't done together. Right. I'm wondering if you can talk about, so the odd part, the irony is that in Newton, the budget is going up, and they wanted an override to keep the teachers, I guess, fed. They didn't close any schools. And now there's a teacher strike. They're going to get even more on top of that more. I guess with Georgia and perhaps other states, there's the declining budget when the enrollment goes down, which is, I think, a reasonable thing. Ratchet it up, ratchet it down. What's going on campuses now? And I guess, what has been the reception? First of all, I want to just compliment you on the Think Better, Write Better part. We're going to get to that book, but I commend you for being able to think better. I think that a fair amount of that was missing on our college campuses. So anyway, perhaps speak to the essence of what's been going on campuses since, how your work has resonated, if at all. I mean, it may not be that people there read Brownstone, and other ramifications, repercussions.
Well, I don't know that any of my colleagues read Brownstone. If they did, they'd probably be camping outside my office door with torches and pitchforks. I don't know. It's funny because when I got the invitation to attend the Brownstone conference in Dallas back in November, that came across my desk probably in August or September. And, as a faculty member, I get allotted a certain amount of travel money, and that's, that was an academic conference. So I thought there's no way they're going to pay my way to a Brownstone conference, but it doesn't hurt to ask. So I filled out the paperwork and sent it up the flagpole, and it came back down to me, with their stamp of approval. And I've got to figure either they were being super open-minded, or more likely they had no idea what Brownstone is. Probably just some functionary looked at what I was asking for and compared it to my allowance and said, okay, that's within, the acceptable limits there. So, okay, we'll approve it. But I certainly expected to be turned down for that. But anyway, what's going on at our campus, at our university, it is in some ways a microcosm, I think, of what's going on nationally, although we are on better footing because we're in Georgia and because we didn't shut down as hard or for as long as a lot of other states. But Georgia State University is the largest university in the state, and it's one of the 10 largest in the country. Pre-COVID, we had about 54,000 students. And I'm not in administration anymore, and I don't see all of these reports. I used to see enrollment reports on a regular basis, and I don't, but I still have a lot of friends in administration. And my understanding is that we lost almost 4,000 students. We got down to just over 50,000 by 2022, but we're coming back up now. Our enrollment is coming back up, and obviously that's a good thing. Now, one of the areas where our enrollment is growing fastest is in online. And, you probably have your opinions about online. And I used to have very strong opinions about online. I used to think it was not nearly as legitimate as on campus. I have moderated that view somewhat for a couple of reasons. One is because I was forced to do it. And I found out that you actually can do it pretty well, or, maybe another way of saying it is it can be done pretty well. And some students, not all, and perhaps not even most, but some students really thrive in that environment. And some courses are much better suited for it than others. A required writing course for students who are already somewhat advanced, who come out of high school already being able to write reasonably well, but they have to take this required writing course to move on. I don't fault them for taking a class online if they can avoid having to drive to campus and so forth. And I've continued to teach a couple of classes online. I teach a couple on campus and a couple online. And that's nice because it gives me some flexibility. I don't have to drive every day. The campus is about 20 miles from my house, and it's, through bad Atlanta traffic. So that's a little bit of a hassle. I don't have to do that every day. But, I had an interesting experience a couple of semesters ago. So one of the things that I have done for years now, for about 12 years, I guess, there at the Alpharetta campus, is that I teach early morning classes. I teach at 7 a.m. at least 2 days a week. And some semesters I've done it all 4 days, 2 different classes, a Monday, Wednesday, and a Tuesday, Thursday, 7 a.m. class. And those classes are typically populated by dual enrollment students. That is, high school kids taking classes for college credit. And some of them are taking all their classes at the college, but most of them come over early in the morning, take a class, and then go over to the high school for the rest of the day, which is the purpose of the 7 a.m. classes, right? And as you can imagine, those are some really good students. So I've had experience with these students for many, many years. Well, a couple of semesters ago, I was teaching a 7 a.m. class, and I was also teaching online. And when the first paper was due, I happened to grade the on campus, the 7 a.m. class on campus first. And I thought, oh my gosh, where did all my good students go? And then I went and graded the papers of the online class, and I thought, oh, there they are. For whatever reason, so many of my best students, and I think many of them are dual enrollment students, had gravitated to online. Probably for the reason I just mentioned, that it's a required course. A lot of them, I don't want to say they didn't need it because they can still learn stuff, but it wasn't that difficult for them because they had, a pretty solid academic background. So that's been a change. Now, that has begun to shift back a little bit. I've got a really good 7 a.m. class this semester. And it's very comparable to my online class. I wouldn't say it's better than, but at least it's comparable to. So maybe things are starting to shift back a little bit. One of the things that I've noticed, changing the subject here slightly, but it's still on an answer to the general question of what's changed. I think during the lockdowns, we collectively, educators at the high school level and at the collegiate level, did a lot more hand holding than we normally do. Now, some teachers are more inclined to hold hands with kids and, treat older teenagers and even young adults like they're small children. Some people are more inclined that way than others. I've always been more matter of fact, you're an adult now, figure it out, get it done. But I think all of us ended up doing more hand holding than we have in the past because we just had so much empathy for these kids. I mean, they're just, think if you were a high school senior, if you say you were a high school baseball player in March of 2020, you're hoping to get a college scholarship, and they just shut everything down. I played high school basketball and a little bit of college basketball, and I loved it. I just ate, slept, and breathed it. That was my life. And if you had shut down my senior season, gosh, I might have been suicidal. And that's the sort of thing that these kids went through. They didn't get to have their prom. They didn't get to have their graduation. They didn't get to have their senior march down the hallway. And so, we felt sorry for them. And so we probably overcompensated and were a little too easy on them in some ways.
Yeah, it's a funny thing. I think we might actually have a better, more popular podcast if we stick to basketball. There's a lot to talk about, but obviously basketball had its own COVID era absurdities. Yeah. People playing in front of no stands, and the irony, actually basketball played into COVID. Now that I'm thinking of it, the big reopening in New York City was precipitated by. Do you remember?
I don't know.
The Knicks finally making the playoffs after like 11, 13 years or whatever it was. And so they had, because the Knicks had a viable team all of a sudden, and they had made the playoffs in 2021, I guess, they had to have people, congregate without, all the crazy stuff. And of course, basketball played a part with Kyrie Irving. And I don't agree with Kyrie Irving on many, 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 many topics.
Right.
My own feeling is, if you look at the moon, it seems like a circle, and the odds are it's probably not a slice of pizza. It's probably spherical. So I disagree with Kyrie Irving on the flat Earth theory, but I kind of applaud his pointing out I've had the illness. I don't need to.
Right. Absolutely.
I don't need to be vaccinated, and I don't care what you do to me. He stood up for his. I mean, I know he's doing it at $45 million a year, which makes it maybe a little bit easier. And but he did get fined a certain amount of that and withdrawn and whatnot. and it caused upheaval for his team, blah, blah, blah. But, I got to say, the guy was right. And Cam Newton, had the illness, and it doesn't, these guys didn't need to. There was a lot of actually information from sports, and I don't mean to digress too much, but the Wall Street Journal had a piece on COVID filtering through football camps and teams, and I think maybe it's late 2020, early 20, I forget. Anyway, somewhere along that line during the hyper intense COVID part, and they were able to do genomic strains because they had the NFL money to do it, and they found that nobody had caught COVID, from each other on the playing field. The only times they got it was at parties. So they go out and have parties. They're in close hotel rooms. They're doing X, Y, and Z, and A, B, and C, and G, H, and I, and whatever, and maybe exchanging other lettered chromosomes and so forth, and they get COVID. And but on the field, even though they have fumble drills and they're breathing on top of each other, nobody caught it from each other because these are healthy guys and they're in close contact. And so there was a lot to be informed by sports. Both the absurdity of people playing in front of empty seats with placards of human faces. How you couldn't write this stuff up. Now you're an English professor, so I assume not only in basketball but elsewise you might have some literary imagination to conjure these things up. Maybe Michael Crichton might have done it, and it's a funny thing. So mentioning Michael Crichton, I'm just wondering if we can maybe segue into your Michael Crichton article, and I'd kind of like to talk about Hayek and a few other things, and then maybe go to credentialism if we want to circle back to the university.
Okay.
So take it up where you are. I'd like to talk about state of fear and your thoughts and article on that.
Well, tying that in with what you're just saying, one of the very first things we learned about this virus is that it was not very dangerous for young people. And, that knowledge and, pretty high level scientific knowledge as early as April of 2020 should have informed everything we did moving forward. But instead, we were captured by this fear, pushed on us by our government and, the medical establishment. Why they did that, I just came from the Brownstone retreat and I heard probably 10 or 15 different talks on the subject of why they did that. And if we get into that, this podcast will be 12 hours long. So I won't. I will invite people to go to brownstone.org and scroll through and read some various takes on why our government did that. But I think I can sum it all up by saying that it's ultimately about control. And that's what Michael Crichton points out in his great novel, State of Fear, which is about climate change. And he's not a quote unquote climate change denier. He's not saying that there aren't potentially some issues that ought to be addressed. He's just pointing out the way that the government uses the fear of that to control people and to push its agenda, which in many cases has nothing to do with climate and solutions that wouldn't solve the problem, assuming it is a problem. And he makes the point in there that governments have always done this. Governments have to control their population, and the easiest way to control people is through fear. And that's where politicized science comes in. One of the first things that I noticed, part of my awakening, so to speak, on COVID was when it became clear to me that our government was saying things that were manifestly not true. And it wasn't about science, it was about politics. So, take the mask issue. I did some research on this early because I thought to myself, first of all, I don't want to wear a piece of cloth over my face, and it just seems really stupid to me. It doesn't seem like it would work. And I did some research on it, and I came across Dennis Rancourt, for example, and some others. And I found out that there had been a dozen, Andrew Boston is another one. I found out that there had been a dozen RCTs prior to COVID showing that that masks are ineffective against an aerosolized respiratory virus. And we knew that. So that being the case, why are they pushing them? And why are they citing all of these, quote unquote studies that are of much lower quality, mechanistic studies and observational studies and things like that are of much lower quality? We have this very high quality research. And of course, the high quality research that's been done since then continues to show that masks don't work. We got Tom Jefferson in Cochrane saying that. And I said to somebody the other day, I was pointing out the high quality evidence that masks don't work. And they said, yeah, but there's also some evidence that they do work. I said, that's not science, that's politics. They have, when you cherry pick the quote unquote science and only cite the studies that support your point of view and completely ignore any studies that contradict your point of view, especially when the studies that seem to support you are of much lower quality, that's not science, that's politics. And when I began to see that, closing the schools is another issue. It was obvious to me that wasn't necessary. So why are we doing it? Because we're playing politics with this virus. I personally don't believe that the virus was intentionally inflicted upon us as some sort of bioweapon. I know there are people who believe that, and people I respect. I personally believe that it was a mistake. And once it got out, they panicked. But even when they figured out, okay, it's not as bad as we feared it might be, it became obvious pretty early on that this was a good way to get rid of Donald Trump. And
Absolutely.
then I think the whole thing was just politics. It was just weaponized. It was all about getting rid of Trump.
Yeah, one of my articles in Brownstone is on Dr. Fauci and that moment when things changed.
I read that. Yes, that was a very good piece.
Well, thank you. It's Dr. Fauci's own gain of function. That it's a pun on gain of function that he actually did. Kind of quantum level up, much as these gain of function genomic changes might do for the organism. But I actually think in tuberculosis and frankly mesothelioma, your body forms a kind of a surround and kill function, and in both those cases, there's a fair amount of damage, and it winds up you're killing the infecting agent. It's, asbestos is not an infection, or tuberculosis, and your macrophages go there to kind of eat the thing, but there's a certain poison in the thing, and so the macrophages die and it becomes this big globby war scene, and then eventually it gets walled off as a thing. It's a granuloma. But I think the actual action reaction and a lot of the damage was because it was eventually transmuted from a human virus into the body politic.
Oh yeah, no question. One of the things I came across early on was about cytokine storms. Am I pronouncing that correctly? Cytokine storms, and how it's with a virus like SARS-CoV-2. It's often the body's reaction to it that causes the harm rather than the virus itself. And one of the pieces that I mapped out in my head but never wrote, I'm sure you've got pieces like that. You think about them, but you just never end up writing them for whatever reason.
Yeah.
Was a comparison of that to what happened politically, because it wasn't the people like to say, oh, COVID shut us down, COVID closed schools, COVID did this. No, COVID didn't do any of that. The government did that. It was the body politics reaction. We had our own political cytokine storm in response to that virus, and we did far more damage to ourselves than the virus ever would have.
Yeah, no, I actually agree with you on a couple different items. First of all, I agree with your leak theory that it was probably incidental, accidental, and coincidental, but not necessarily premeditated. Because in my view, it would have been done better. It would not have happened and started in Wuhan. I think it would have started somewhere else. But there's a term of art which I think should be more popular. I got mine from Andrew Clavin, but he didn't invent it. And I've actually tried to source the provenance of the term, but it's conspiracy of interest.
Yeah.
Because everyone's a conspiracy theory, and most of them are wrong. But if you're a conspiracy of interest theorist, you might always be right. So the example I use it for my Zika book, not in the book, but talking about it, is that something happens and then people will find it to their use or not. So the example I use metaphorically is like I'm walking down the street on a hot day, I've got an ice cream cone, bugs, ants, squirrels, they're not thinking about my ice cream. Okay, they're going about their day. If it just so happens that it melts, I'm not paying attention, the ice cream falls to the ground, I don't want to pick it up. Okay, it's a calamity for me of a minor scale, and I move on. Now the ants, the flies, the squirrels, I don't know, they're going to figure it out all amongst themselves. All of a sudden, it's an item for them. So they have some opportunity, and they will make a conspiracy of ants to capitalize on the ice cream, and the conspiracy of flies, and they're going to work maybe to deter the squirrels if they could, or vice versa. So everyone's going to have their own formulation how to deal with this. And in the Zika microcephaly phenomenon, 2015-16, because it coincided with the concept of having to make emergency abortions, if you might have a chance of having a microcephalic baby because you might have experienced Zika, maybe Zika caught, whatever. All of a sudden, it was adopted by the left in Brazil, which has still no abortion legal, and it became a cause célèbre. They brought it to their Supreme Court, all this kind of stuff, and I think it was oddly and macabrely fanned into more than it was because it presented this opportunity that aligned with certain other interests. And then it also aligned with environmentalism because there's this theory and this concept that the tropical illnesses are moving north because of climate and all that kind of stuff. So therefore, the whole world has to be concerned about this tropical thing, blah, blah, blah. And the science was never really there, well-founded at the time. A little bit like the way we ignored, the Diamond Princess here. People ignored the fact there were no Zika tests in Brazil. There was no microcephaly registry. And even that following year, 2016, the very, very, very next few months, they didn't find any increase in microcephaly. They haven't found it anywhere else on Earth since then, blah, blah, blah. Anyway, that's read my book thing. But this has been going on for a while, that the conspiracy of interest happens. So when something happens, the ice cream falls, in this case, the COVID happens. And I think there's some, CYA aspects to with Dr. Fauci being involved with the gain of function research, Wuhan, and the money flow, and that people wanted to cover their own posteriors at the same time that they could make it into something else. That's where the conspiracy of interest happened.
Okay.
That's Michael Crichton's next book, if he can write from heaven.
No, I think there's that makes a lot of sense to me. That clarifies some things in my mind too. So thank you for sharing that. So what you wanted to talk about the serfdom piece as well?
I want to do serfdom, and then I want to do credentialing, clogging Gay, Harvard, the decay of the universities. So
I thought about that and the title of it is Serfdom Humanity's Default? And I thought back to like George W. Bush, for example, back in the early days of the quote unquote war on terror, saying things like, and I'm paraphrasing slightly here, but basically saying, everybody wants freedom. Everybody yearns to be free. And at the time, I kind of believed that. But the older I get and the more I look, especially at what's going on now, I wonder, is that really true? Do people, does everybody want to be free? Obviously, some people do, but it appears to me that some people just want to be taken care of, and they will happily trade their freedom for what appears to them to be security, although it's often a phantom security. And that's basically what that piece is about. When I first started thinking about it, I actually wanted to title it, is fascism humanity's default? Because, serfdom is the condition of the majority of the people in a system like that. But fascism is the system of government. I know fascism is a word we throw around nowadays. Basically, it means something you don't like. Oh, you're a fascist. You're a big meanie. But basically, fascism is a system where the government controls everything. It doesn't own everything like in communism directly, but it controls it. And the government might allow you to start a company and make a bunch of money as long as you're on board with the government's aims. But if not, they're going to shut you down. It's like communism. It's a form of statism. And it occurs to me, and maybe some of the political theorists and historians out there will shoot these ideas down because I'm neither of those. But it occurs to me that the old feudal system was not that different from modern day fascist system. You had the duke or the earl or the king, and he had people under him who were allowed to go out and make money as long as they contributed to the coffers and as long as they did the right things. But he still could rule with a tight fist, and the majority of people were basically just serfs, and that's how it is under a fascist order. I decided not to go that route exactly, to talk more about the condition of the people rather than the condition of the government, because I think my ideas are probably fairly controversial there, and I didn't want to shoot myself in the foot, and frankly I wasn't 100% certain of those theories, but I do have this theory. I'll throw it out there for your listeners, for you and for your listeners. And again, I may be 70, 80% certain of this. I can certainly be persuaded otherwise, but I have a theory that all modern political systems basically devolve into fascism, and they can come at it from different directions. For example, in a free market, quote unquote capitalist economy, what happens is that people start petitioning the government in behalf of their companies, and the government gets on board with certain companies and they're not as on board with other companies. And over time, you get a situation like we have today, which is basically a corporatist system, which is kind of like fascism light, where the government supports certain types of automobile manufacturers and, drug manufacturers. And, if you remember Common Core under Obama, they supported certain textbook companies, but not others. I mean, that's just corporatism. And it comes from a place of capitalism, but it devolves into something that is, some people call it crony capitalism, but it's really just fascism light. Mm. And then on the other end of the spectrum, you have like the communist Chinese, who really aren't communist anymore. The basic problem with communism is that it can't pay the bills. And so the communists had to allow certain approved individuals to go out and make a bunch of money as long as they're on board with the official government line. And that's not communism, that's fascism. And so here we are, the US system and the Chinese system getting darn close to meeting each other in the middle, even though we came at it from two different ends of the spectrum. And so that's my theory that
it's not bad. It's not bad. I think there's a natural decay. I had Aaron Day on just the other day.
Yeah, I talked to Aaron this past weekend,
and he presents that fiat currencies have a certain lifetime. I think the average per nation is 27 years, and for a particular currency to be dominant is around 90 years or so. And right. The U.S. has exceeded both of those, fortunately, and may it continue. However, speaking as a physician, the pathognomonic signs of decay or disease is inflation. And I think that comes down to root cause that the people in power are humans and they are greedy. And the easiest way to get money in government is to print it. Taxation involves a little bit of give and take and potential, rioting on the streets, or if you take anything away, take away, free bread or whatever, quote unquote free. People But on the other hand, if you just print money, you can do it somewhat surreptitiously and have the same effect. You just wind up diluting everything, maybe diluting yourself and others at the same time. And that is almost the way of all flesh of governments. And in order to do that, you have to be, kind of in the tank for yourself and presumably your cronies who are keeping you afloat. So I think that is a kind of a natural progression. Getting to the capitalism part, capitalism is, first of all, it's a pejorative. I think it's a Marxian pejorative.
Absolutely.
I prefer to think of it as free marketism. It's harder to get off the tongue. But even the stirrings of that, I was for some reason looking at the Hanseatic League because I learned it in like elementary school and I totally forgot about it. But I've been thinking about all these guilds, and that's where the word first came to my mind. And I had literally not touched on the Hanseatic League in the interim, which is since for my case I was in elementary. I'm only like 25, 30 years old. It's just anyway. What they did there was they basically brought incredible wealth to the Northern Europe because people could trade all of a sudden. However, you had to be in the guild. So if you're a furrier or barrel maker, whatever, everything was awesome, and you could start to trade to all these places far afield. It was like eBay of the time. You could basically get the best price for your item worldwide, as it were, through the universe. But you had to be part of the club. So a little bit like Sam's Club, meets eBay, meets militia, because the essence of the Hanseatic League was things had to be transported, but there were pirates and the people taking things. They needed their own army, so you needed like a certain amount of moats around it. Now I get it; it maybe wasn't kind if you weren't part of the guild. On the other hand, you couldn't do it without the armor to protect your shipments. And this is we see this today. We have free marketism, say, in the Wild West of the internet, but there's also hacking. There's also scammers and whatnot. So you need, for every action, you need a reaction. You need for every detection, you need protection. There's not a question there.
Right.
So maybe we can, if you want to, speak to that, you can. But otherwise, maybe we can go to some of the aspects of the university. We're rounding out the hour here, and I'd like to get your thoughts on the new meaning of gay, Claudine Gay.
Well, I joked that if she left Harvard, she wouldn't even be able to apply for a job in Florida because down there they can't even say her name, right? But yeah, let's talk about credentialism a little bit, because I think the whole Claudine Gay thing was a great illustration of that, and it's something that I've observed throughout the years in my career. And for the most part, I haven't worked at, elite institutions. And I don't mean to denigrate Georgia State University, which is a fine university, by saying that. But I've had a lot of experience with a lot of different types of institutions, but not really elite institutions. So, maybe people would dispute some of the things I'm going to say on that basis. But I certainly have noticed over the years a rise in what I call credentialism. You might also call it careerism, where you have the administrative class. And again, I was an administrator for 20 years, so perhaps I even benefited from this system to some degree. But the way it used to work is that there's a lot of paperwork involved in being a professor, keeping track of various things, grades and attendance and reports and so forth. And so the administrators were people who sort of voluntarily took that on so that the professors wouldn't be distracted from their real work. And usually they were professors themselves, and typically they sort of took turns at doing the administrative chores. But over the last 150 years, that has morphed into a separate administrative class who run things. The professors are no longer in charge. Even at your elite universities, the professors aren't in charge. The administrators are in charge. And if you doubt that for a moment, just look at how relatively easy it was for Claudine Gay as a dean to run off Roland Fry, who was at least sanction him severely. He was an eminent economist. He was an eminent scholar, and she is not by any stretch an eminent scholar. And yet, because she was the dean and he was just a faculty member, she was able to just run roughshod right over him. So, if faculty think for a moment that they're in charge, they're deluding themselves. I mean, tenured faculty have some power, but ultimately the administrators call the shots. They also make a lot more money. I mean, a mid-level administrator makes half again what a tenured faculty member makes. And an upper-level administrator can make 2 to 3 times what a faculty member makes, even someone who's been there for years. So, the message is, if you want to make a lot of money, and also if you're not, maybe you get into higher ed and discover that you don't really like teaching, it's a lot of work, and grading papers isn't fun, and you don't make as much money as you thought you might, and so all of those are good reasons to get on the administrative ladder. And I'm not trying to demonize administrators. We need administrators because we need people to do the work of administration, and good administrators can make a huge difference in a department or a division or a school. And there are people out there who are very good administrators. So I don't mean to disparage all of them by any means, but the trend that I've noticed is people getting into administration just so that they can make more money, just so that they don't have to do the dirty work that goes along with teaching. And in some cases, just so they can tell people what to do. In other words, to advance their own careers and not advance the aims of the academy. And I think that's a bad trend. And I think Claudine Gay is in many ways the culmination of that trend.
Well, there's a joke. First of all, let me preface, my dad and my brother and my brother-in-law, all attorneys, my late father. But there's a joke.
Oh, you're the black sheep.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So the joke is, it's only 99% of attorneys that give the rest a bad name.
Yeah, fair enough.
So I think we can kind of apply that to, a fair amount of, you fill in the blank, Hollywood, academics, present company excluded medicine, and so forth. I think everybody wound up, here we used to have a store, Filene's Basement. I don't know if you've heard of it. It's long gone, but I think it was kind of like Filene's debasement. We went a level below the basement. We went to debasement, and along the lines of fascism, fascism wasn't always a bad thing, as it were. I'm speaking historically, dear NSA. The original fascia was a symbol of the Roman Senate, and the concept is that each of those straws is breakable by itself, but you band a bunch of straws together and you can hold a sword with it. And so it's strong enough to hold something. And that's the idea of the fascia, which just means a bundle.
Right.
And, we have fasciitis. We have, fascia in our body. That's, a collection of tendons and ligament and whatnot that is stronger by virtue of being together. So there is a natural fascistic tendency, in a sense, for people, because individually we're just little fleshy globs and we're vulnerable. But, if you form a phalanx, you form, I forget the group thing that the Romans had when they put all their shields out, like a turtle.
A phalanx. Yeah, that's right.
Whatever that's called. Do you remember the name of that?
I think phalanx. I think that's correct.
Well, that's one of them. But there's another one. Anyway, so you're protected when you are grouped together, and whether it's the Hanseatic League or whatever, that is kind of like something we have to battle against. But in respect to some of the professional aspects, there's professional and confessional. And when you take on a profession, I think there's some aspects of clergy and whatnot that you have a bond to that person. And so if I'm somebody's attorney, I'm somebody's physician, so forth, I can't necessarily be treating society. I have to really be looking at the interest of that person. I think that's something that was lost here when we treated all kids the same. When we treated, we start like nasal swabbing everybody if they want to enter their classroom and so forth. I think this is an absurdity to treat 18-year-olds like 80-year-olds. They're not. And mind you, the testing gets skewed anyway. I had an article back early on in this pandemic thing in 2020, how Bayes' theorem, if you're familiar with it, but he was actually a minister as well as a mathematician, Thomas Bayes. And he pointed out that when you test something in a place that's unlikely to find it, you'll get more false, you can call it false positive, but that's what happens. So this random testing we did, or provisional testing, so people could enter a building and whatnot, on young people who are asymptomatic, that's totally skewed the essence of what that test meant. And then we went on that data, which was crazy. Anyway, we're kind of near the end of our hour. I'd like some closing thoughts from you, and then I'll put up your book in the background, and
Okay.
And we can maybe call it a day.
Well, let me just close with going back to your thoughts on people grouping together, for security, for strength, and that is, I mean, humanity has done that since the beginning of time, right? We formed communities in order to protect ourselves, to protect each other, to protect our interests, and that's good up to a point. The question becomes, how much of your individual liberty are you willing to sacrifice for the sake of the group? And that's always a negotiation. I mean, that is the fundamental negotiation of society, isn't it? And I think where Brownstone is coming from, where we as Americans have always come from, is we are prepared to sacrifice a certain amount of individualism, personal liberty, whatever you want to call it, for the sake of the group. But there is a point beyond which we will not go, because then it starts to become totalitarianism. It starts to become authoritarianism. And there's Ben Franklin's famous quote about people who sacrifice liberty for security soon find that they don't have either. And I think that's what we saw. People gave up so much bodily autonomy in this effort to avoid this virus, which was never as dangerous as it was billed to be. And they gave up way too much. And they didn't gain what they thought they would gain. They didn't gain the protection that they hoped to gain. You could even argue that they're worse off than before.
Oh, clearly.
But certainly no better off health-wise, and worse off in every other way.
Yeah, I think of the kids with the T-shirt. My parents went to Las Vegas and all I got was this lousy T-shirt. I think that we closed the world down. We took away commerce.
Yeah.
The people that supposedly everyone default cares about. The impoverished and whatnot. They got more. So the inner city underclass got less educated. The gap
Absolutely
increased. If you're living in Senegal or Ghana or whatever, your major conduit for getting better disappeared, at least temporarily. And this kind of draconian one size fits all that we're worried in Belgium or Brussels or whatever about X, so you should be worried about it in Kenya is nonsensical. And frankly, some of the best pushback came from sub-Saharan Africa. That's another day, another topic. I want to show people your book here. They can learn from you. So this is the 9 virtues of exceptional leaders, unlocking your leadership potential. I also want people to check out Think Better, Write Better, which I thought should be Write Betterer. But we're going to have to work on the price here. It's
a textbook. What can I say? That's what textbook companies do. I wish I could get the price down. I've talked to them about it, but
I don't know. You might have to make a different version.
I might have to make a different version, and there might be some editions, popping up on Yahoo that you could get a lot cheaper than that. But
okay, and so people can find you writing on Brownstone, as we've mentioned before. And
That's
just
right.
As a final plug, if people want to help support my videocast, podcast, discussions, conversations, etc., and my blathering on here and there, they can go buy this book, Overturning Zika. The money will go right into my hot little hands, and it's even better if they read it. But that might be too much to ask. But I think it's a lot that people could have learned from this had they applied it. And point of fact, I actually it wasn't a book at that time, but in early 2020, I'd written an article which I wanted to be in the Wall Street Journal kind of op-ed era or area of concern. And I sent it out to 45 magazines, newspapers, TV, all the top medical science journals. And it got a nibble at JAMA, which is the Journal of the American Medical Association. And I was on a Zoom call with the erstwhile 2 chief medical officers who later had to commit heady kitty by cancel culture. Another day, another topic. But at the time they were there, and Dr. Livingston said that he thought my article was, irrefutable and could very well provide the answer why Zika microcephaly had disappeared, and he wanted to publish it. And I was like, I felt that little frisson and happiness and so forth. And he said, but it's early 2020. There's this coronavirus thing coming around the corner. We don't want to sow any doubt in the public health establishment with a new potential problem coming. I said, well, dude, I'm like, doctor, sir, doctor, this is exactly the time you'd want to do that, because you don't want, there's actions, there's overreactions. But I think it's important to keep all things in perspective. Everyone there is human as well. And we also make mistakes. And I think it's, even casting that aside, I think people can also keep 2 thoughts in their mind at the same time, that, the hundreds of millions of young families that are kind of still thinking, mind you, even today, that a single mosquito bite can ruin their future child. They deserve some reprieve from this. And this article can at least, start that conversation that Zika is a real virus. I get it. It's a little dengue virus, but dengue never caused microcephaly. And there's no more microcephaly. And even in Brazil, there's no more. And so the theory's flawed, and obviously it doesn't work. And don't they deserve a break today at McDonald's? And he said, yeah, maybe you're right, but we're going to revisit this in a couple of weeks when the coronavirus thing blows over.
Well, that's, and that's classic politicization of science. When you refuse to tell the truth, you decline to tell the truth for political reasons. That's exactly what we're talking about.
Yeah, I remember Heinrich Ibsen, Enemy of the People. I saw that on Broadway-ish when I was in high school. And I think my father fell asleep, but I was awake. And it's the same basic concept. He discovers something in their spa town that, the waters are not actually, they've got some, I don't know, arsenic or something in it. And he wants to tell everybody, but that's going to ruin the town industry. And I think he's actually got a better point. I mean, the people have a better point than what happened here, because I don't think there was any real benefit overall to all the self-flagellation we did and closed lockdowns and whatnot. Anyway, Rob, Professor Jenkins, thank you so much for your time today.
Well, thank you for having me on. I enjoyed it tremendously.
All right. Well, and vice versa. I learned a lot from your articles and from the genesis of those articles, you in person. Thank you.
Thank you. Take care.